The Blue Nile, a river originating at Lake Tana in Ethiopia. It travels for approximately 1,450 kilometers 900 miles through Ethiopia and Sudan. Along with the White Nile, it is one of the two major tributaries of the Nile and supplies about 85.6% of the water to the Nile during the rainy season. Blue Nile River, headstream of the Nile River and source of almost 70% of its floodwater at Khartoum. It reputedly rises as the Abay from a spring 6,000 feet, 1,800 meters, above sea level, near Lake Tana in northwestern Ethiopia. The river flows into and out of the lake, runs through a series of rapids, and then drops into a gorge. It flows through a deep canyon southeast and west around the Choke Mountains and then turns northwest through Sudan to join the White Nile at Khartoum. Its length is about 907 miles, 1,460 kilometers. By far the greater part of the Blue Nile's waters come from such tributaries as the Dinder and Rahad rivers, which rise in the Ethiopian highlands. The Al-Ruṣayriṣ and Sannār dams in Sudan irrigate 1 million acres, 400,000 hectares, in the plain of Al-Jazīrah, Gezira, between the Blue Nile and White Nile rivers. The Sannār Dam also produces hydroelectric power. The distance of the river from its source to its confluence has been variously reported between 1,460 and 1,600 kilometers, 910 and 990 miles. This uncertainty might result from the fact that the river flows through a series of virtually impenetrable gorges cut in the Ethiopian highlands to a depth of some 1,500 meters, 4,900 feet. According to materials published by the Central Statistical Agency, an Ethiopian government agency, the Blue Nile has a total length of 1,450 kilometers, 900 miles, of which 800 kilometers, 500 miles, are inside Ethiopia. The Blue Nile originates at Lake Tana in Ethiopia, where it is called the Abay River. The river flows generally south before entering a canyon about 400 kilometers 250 miles long, about 30 kilometers 19 miles from Lake Tana, which is a tremendous obstacle for travel and communication between North and South Ethiopia. The canyon was first referred to as the Grand Canyon in 1968 by a British team that accomplished the first descent of the river from Lake Tana to the end of the canyon. Subsequent river rafting parties called it the Grand Canyon of the Nile. The Blue Nile Falls, Amharic, Tiz Abay, literally Great Smoke, one of Ethiopia's biggest tourist attractions, is located at the start of the canyon. The river loops across northwest Ethiopia before being fed by numerous tributaries between Lake Tana and the Ethiopia-Sudan border. Those on its left bank, in downstream order, include the Wanka River, the Bashalo River, the Wailaka River, the Wanchit River, the Jama River, the Mugger River, the Guda River, the Agwel River, the Neti River, the Didsa River and the Dabus River. Those on the right side, also in downstream order, include the Handassa, Tul, Abaya, Sada, Tami, Cha, Shita, Suha, Muga, Gula, Temsha, Bachad, Katlan, Heba, Kamoga, Wetter and the Beles. The Blue Nile then heads northwest into Sudan. It travels for approximately 650 kilometers 400 miles, flowing past Al-Ruṣayriṣ and receiving the Dinder River on its right bank at Dinder. At Khartoum, the Blue Nile joins the White Nile and, as the Nile, flows through Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea at Alexandria. The flow of the Blue Nile reaches maximum volume in the rainy season from June to September, when it supplies 80 to 86% of the water of the Nile proper. The river was a major source of the flooding of the Nile in Egypt that contributed to the fertility of the Nile Valley and the consequent rise of ancient Egypt and Egyptian mythology. With the completion of the Aswan Dam in 1970, these floods stopped occurring in Lower Egypt. During the summer monsoon season, the Blue Nile floods erode a vast amount of fertile soil from the Ethiopian highlands and carry it downstream as silt, turning the water dark brown or almost black. The Blue Nile is vital to the livelihood of Egypt. As the most significant tributary of the Nile, it contributes over 85% of the Nile's stream flow. Though shorter than the White Nile, 59% of the water that reaches Egypt originates from the Ethiopian highlands via the Blue Nile. The river is also an important resource for Sudan, where the Al-Ruṣayriṣ Dam and Sannār Dam contribute to the 80% of the country's electricity generation from hydropower. These dams also help irrigate the Gezira scheme, which is most famous for its high-quality cotton, as well as wheat and animal feed crop production in the area. In November 2012, Ethiopia began construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a 6,000 megawatt hydroelectric dam on the river. The dam is expected to be a boost for the Ethiopian economy. Sudan and Egypt, however, voiced their concerns over a potential reduction in water available. Electricity generation began in February 2022. The Egyptian fear that Ethiopia might block the Blue Nile was a major factor in the long and complex Ethiopian-Egyptian relationship. While Egypt relied on Ethiopia for its waters, Ethiopia depended on the Coptic Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria for patriarchal authority and the appointment of its metropolitan. This interdependence has shaped events since the 11th century. For centuries, the threat of blocking the Blue Nile was an effective strategy in ensuring the appointment of Egyptian metropolitans. However, in practice, neither a diversion nor large-scale use of the river's waters was ever attempted. An early crisis emerged during the reign of Zagwe Kingabur Meskel Lalibela, whom the Egyptians suspected of attempting to divert the river, even though his kingdom never extended to the Blue Nile. It was Emperor Mda Seyon I who first occupied the Blue Nile basin and began spreading Christianity there. The emperors of the Solomonic dynasty, particularly Dawud II, Yashak I, and Zara Yaqub, continued asserting Ethiopia's control over the river as a diplomatic tool. They also reinforced this concept in religious terms, identifying the Blue Nile with the biblical Gihon and adapting the Tamara Mariam to legitimize their authority over the waters. Medieval European myths about a powerful Christian Ethiopia aiding in the destruction of Islam further elevated the significance of the Blue Nile in Ethio-Egyptian relations. The first European known to have seen the Blue Nile in Ethiopia and the river's source was Pedro Pez, a Spanish Jesuit who reached the river's source on April 21, 1618. However, the Portuguese João Bermudez, the self-described Patriarch of Ethiopia, provided the first description of the Abay River Falls in his memoirs published in 1565, and any number of Europeans who lived in Ethiopia in the late 15th century such as Pero de Cuvilha could have seen the river long before Pez, but not reached its source. The source of the Nile proper was also reached in 1629 by the Portuguese Jesuit missionary Geronimo Lobo and in 1770 by the Scottish explorer James Bruce. Although European explorers contemplated tracing the course of the Nile from the Blue Nile's confluence with the White Nile to Lake Tana, the Blue Nile Canyon has discouraged all attempts since Frederick Cailliaud's attempt in 1821. The first serious attempt by a non-local to explore this reach of the river was undertaken by the American W.W. Macmillan in 1902, assisted by the Norwegian explorer B.H. Jensen. Jensen proceeded upriver from Khartoum while Macmillan sailed downstream from Lake Tana. However, Jensen's boats were blocked by the rapids at Fameka short of the Sudan-Ethiopia border, and Macmillan's boats were wrecked shortly after they had been launched. Macmillan encouraged Jensen to try to sail upstream from Khartoum again in 1905, but he was forced to stop 500 kilometers 300 miles short of Lake Tana. Robert Cheeseman, who records his surprise on arriving in Ethiopia at finding that the upper waters of one of the most famous of the rivers of the world, and one whose name was well known to the ancients was in his lifetime marked on the map by dotted lines, managed to map the upper course of the Blue Nile between 1925 and 1933. He did this not by following the river along its banks and through its impassable canyon but by following it from the highlands above, traveling some 8,000 kilometers 5,000 miles by mule in the adjacent country. In the 1950s and 1960s, several kayakers paddled parts of the canyon. In 1968, at the request of Haile Selassie, a team of 60 British and Ethiopian servicemen and scientists made the first full descent of the river from Lake Tana to a point near the Sudanese border led by explorer John Blashford's Nile. The team used specially built Avon inflatables and modified Royal Engineers assault boats to navigate the formidable rapids. Subsequent rafting expeditions in the 1970s and 1980s generally only covered parts of the river canyon. In 1999, writer Virginia Morell and photographer Nevada Weir made the journey by raft from Lake Tana to Sudan, publishing a documentary about their journey afterwards. In 2000, American and National Geographic reader, Kenneth Franz, saw a photo taken by Nevada Weir for National Geographic which would lead him to found the charity Bridges to Prosperity. This photo showed a bridge broken during World War II, with 10 men on either side of the broken span pulling each other across the dangerous gap by rope. This historic bridge was built by Emperor Facilities in approximately 1660, with Roman bridge technology brought to Ethiopia by Portuguese soldiers during the battle with the Muslim invaders in 1507. In both 2001 and 2009, Bridges to Prosperity volunteers traveled from the United States to repair the broken bridge across the Blue Nile and later built a new suspension bridge not susceptible to flood. On April 28, 2004, geologist Pascal Skatero and his partner, kayaker and documentary filmmaker Gordon Brown, became the first known people to navigate the Blue Nile in its entirety. Though their expedition included several others, Brown and Skatero were the only ones to remain on the expedition for the entire journey. They chronicled their adventure with an IMAX camera and 2 handheld video cameras, sharing their story in the film Mystery of the Nile and in a book of the same title. On January 29, 2005, Canadian Leigh Jickling and his teammate New Zealander Mark Tanner completed the first fully human-powered transit of the entire Blue Nile and the Nile in the Sudan and Egypt. Their journey of over 5,000 kilometers (3,100 miles) took 5 months and traveled through Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. They recount that they paddled through civil war conflict zones, regions known for bandits, and encountered multiple hazards and rapids. Thank you for watching this video.